Show for you today. My guest will be Kristin Lawless. She is an author and an independent writer, and she has a book called Formerly Known as Food, How the Industrial Food System is Changing Our Minds, Bodies, and Culture. And I'm really excited to have this conversation with her and have her on to talk about our food system. But first, I want to go over some things going on in the news, some ways that you guys can take action, and then, of course, share my weekly recipe with you. So first off, my Zoom cooking classes are continuing to be a big hit with those that participate. I'm really enjoying doing it a lot. As someone who loves to entertain, this is as close as I'm getting to entertaining these days. So my Zoom cooking classes, I invite you all to join in. I've moved the time from 5 o'clock Eastern Time to 6 o'clock so that it's an hour later, so those that are working and have to deal with kids have a little bit more time to get to the Zoom call. And last night we made coconut-encrusted tofu with a mango salsa, and that's the recipe I'll be sharing with you. It's just such a great dish. We'll be excited to share that with you. I wanted to just go over some ways that you can take action and get involved. The latest Recovery Act, for those that don't know, called the HEROES Act, which stands for the Health and Economic Recovery Omnibus Emergency Solutions Act, just passed, and it includes a bailout for the 4 largest factory meat companies, Tyson, Cargill, JBS, and Smithfield. And we know that these have been hot spots for the coronavirus. And, this is the industrial agricultural system that is not working. It's the industrial agricultural system that is not resilient and not able to adjust to what's going on in our world right now. And yet the small family farms are, and they're the ones that need our support. So there's a petition on my website to tell Congress not to bail out these big industrial meat factory farms, but to support the independent family farmers. They're the ones that really need it. It's just so important. I did a fly-in lobbying session last week with the National Organic Coalition, and NOFA New York is one of the members of that coalition. And we, met with different senators. I had a meeting with Schumer and Gillibrand, as well as my representative, Tom Suozzi, asking them to support real organic, meaning, to support the origin of destination, where the animals come from, where the meat comes from. That's a loophole in the organic standards. There's, so many big corporations now involved in organic that they're really trying to weaken the standards and allow more and more things into organic food that we don't want. And so, we talked about that. Anyway, it was just really great to feel like I was being politically active and, doing something for this. And there's ways that we all can be active and sign petitions. I want to share with you some really great news is that the Williams Pipeline, which I've been talking about for months, actually years. I mean, this is the third time that Governor Cuomo actually rejected the proposal, and I think this will be the final time. But this pipeline was, going to go from Pennsylvania through New Jersey, through Staten Island, across New York Harbor, and it was just bad. There was nothing good about it. And so finally it was rejected again. But the consolidation of our food supply is wreaking havoc on our environment, our health, on fair labor wages, on animal welfare. Factory farms, and that's why I don't support bailing them out. They're just wrecking our country. They're wrecking the world. It's just not the way we should be raising food for so many reasons. Right now, we currently produce 1.6 billion animals. We have 1.6 billion animals in our nation's 25,000 factory farms. And all of these animals produce approximately 885 billion pounds of poop or manure each year, which pollutes our air, pollutes our water. It releases climate warming emissions, and it's just unsustainable, and we just cannot have it. And so people need to cut down on their meat intake. They need to support smaller operations that are raising the animals in a more humane way, allowing them out to pasture, which actually then fertilizes the soil. And it's just a whole different process. And so if you're going to eat meat, that's the kind of meat you want to support. And now I would like to share with all of you my recipe from this week, which was the coconut-encrusted tofu with a mango salsa. This recipe is just so versatile. The coconut-encrusted tofu is something you can use as a foundation for many different toppings. This one has the mango salsa, but you can put, a curry on top of it. You can put, a bean type of salsa on top of it. You can do a lot of different things. And then the mango salsa is also versatile. You can put mango salsa on top of so many different things, on top of fish, on top of an orzo, and make a salad out of it. Anyway, so here we go. For the tofu, you need a cake of extra firm organic tofu, and you're going to cut that into about 8 pieces. A quarter cup of organic coconut milk, a half a cup of shredded coconut, that's unsweetened organic coconut, and then half a cup of either breadcrumbs, or I like to use cornflakes that I puree in the full food processors so they become like breadcrumbs, but they're cornflakes, and then it's also gluten-free. You can also use gluten-free breadcrumbs if you'd like. And then a quarter teaspoon of salt, and that's for dipping the tofu into. And then for the chutney, you need 3 mangoes, 1 red pepper diced, 1 small red onion diced finely, 2 limes that you're going to juice, 3 tablespoons of fresh cilantro, 1 tablespoon of honey, and a quarter teaspoon of salt. So you're going to start by cutting the tofu into the slices and lay them out on a dish towel and cover them with another dish towel and just lightly press it. So you're going to dry it and take the water out of it. Then you're going to bring out 2 pie pans. One you're going to put the coconut and cornflakes into, along with the salt. And the other one you're going to put the coconut milk into. And you're going to basically bread the tofu cutlets. So you're going to dip them in the coconut milk, then dip them in the coconut and corn mixture, and then you're going to lay them out onto a cookie sheet. We're going to bake these. So you want to preheat your oven at 375. We're going to lay them out on a cookie sheet that you want to line with parchment paper and spray with olive oil. If you don't have parchment paper, you can just spray your cookie sheet with olive oil. That's fine, too. And then lay the tofu cutlets right on that, and you're going to bake it in the oven until they're golden brown. And I usually bake it for about 15 minutes. Everyone's oven's a little different, so keep checking. And then halfway through, turn it over and bake the other side face down so that both sides get golden brown and crunchy. And then you're going to remove that from the oven. Meanwhile, you're going to make the mango salsa. Just combine all those ingredients in a bowl and let all those flavors come together. And then when the tofu cutlets are ready, by baking them, they're not very greasy. If you fry them, you would actually want to lay them out on a paper towel to absorb some of the oil. But this way, they come out golden brown. They're not oily. So you're just going to lay them out beautifully on a platter and then garnish it with the salsa right down the middle. And save some of the salsa to serve on the side in a separate bowl. And you're going to garnish it with some fresh cilantro, and that's it. It's really easy, it's delicious, and I recommend it to all of you. And now, and please join my Zoom class. The next one will be next Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. And now it's my pleasure to introduce to all of you Kristin Lawless. Kristin is the author of formerly known as Food, How the Industrial Food System is Changing Our Minds, Bodies, and Culture. And this book won the Green Prize for Sustainable Literature in 2019. Kristin's an independent journalist focusing on the intersections of food, health, politics, and culture. Her journalism and columns have appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Newsweek, and Vice. And she has some great articles that just came out that we'll talk about as well. And Kristin is also a certified nutrition educator, and she lives with her husband and son in California. Kristin, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Sure. So in your book, you talk about the whole egg theory. Can you talk a little bit what you mean about the whole egg theory? What is that?
Sure. That's basically my philosophy of eating, and essentially it's you want to eat foods that are whole and intact, like the whole egg. And I use the egg as an example because for decades we've been told to not eat the yolk, make egg white omelets, use some terrible industrial product like egg beaters, and
right.
somehow these will be healthier for us than just the simple whole egg, which actually is a nutritional powerhouse, and the yolk contains so many vital nutrients, especially for brain health, fetal development, B vitamins. I mean, it goes on. And so I use the egg as just a prime example of the way the food companies have kind of manipulated the science and the dietary guidelines to suit their interests. And you can take that idea of the whole egg and apply it to all other foods we eat. And it's a great way to, when you're looking at foods, and think to yourself, is this a whole food, or has it been something's been extracted, taken away, added? You could even look at it when you're looking at ingredient labels and think about, is this a whole food ingredient or not? And so it's just kind of like an overarching philosophy on a whole foods diet.
Right. Yeah, they did the same thing with butter. Don't eat butter, eat margarine, which is a processed food. Don't eat, instead of eating regular whole yogurt, they said eat low-fat or non-fat yogurt, which takes out so many of the good nutrients. Yeah, like you said, It goes on and on.
Yeah, I mean, those are two great examples, because with margarine, which we were told for decades that would be better for our health to eat the trans fats in those products rather than the whole natural fat occurring in butter. And then it turns out, after 50 years of this advice, oops, we made a giant mistake. Those kinds of fats are the only kind of fats that we know damage arteries and lead to heart disease. And Walter Willett at Harvard has called this the biggest public health crisis in history, responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths. And so if you look at that as an example, it's easy to see that these kinds of dietary guidelines have failed us, and that's really illustrated by the skyrocketing rates of chronic disease that we've seen.
Yeah, absolutely. I also always find it funny when I think of dietitians who set up, the school lunch program and hospital food as our, model for healthy food, and it's far from that. So
again, totally corrupted by those industries that profit from supplying. I mean, those are huge industries, supplying the school lunches, supplying the hospitals. That's where a huge bulk of the food supply goes. And in fact, dietitians that are educated at sort of the more conventional nutrition schools, they are getting basically their education through industry. And I talk about that a lot in the book, and how the conferences and things that the dietitians attend, McDonald's is there, Coca-Cola is there, talking about how, you can have diet soda and that's good for you, or you can go to McDonald's and you can get their low-fat options, So it's really a major problem, because so many people have kind of bought into that messaging, and now we have this uphill battle of trying to re-educate people to move away from these kinds of industrial foods and back towards just plain, organic, hopefully whole foods.
Right. Well, I'm hoping a little silver lining from this pandemic is that more people are getting back into the kitchen and cooking some more whole foods. I'd like to say that anyway. But it seems to be, where you can't find yeast in the supermarket anymore, and running out of flour. Hopefully, people aren't just baking cookies with it.
Right. No,
so
I think that's definitely
you
true.
also referred to the microbiota. I don't even know if I'm saying it right. Microbiota.
The microbiota. Mm-hmm.
Microbiota. Yeah, I guess I've called it microbiome. But anyway, tell us what that is and why should people care about it?
The microbiota is a collection of trillions of bacterial cells that live in and on us, and basically researchers think it's essentially an organ unto itself, and just as important to our overall health as any other organ. And there's just so much to still be understood and learned about it. In the book, I really talk about the gut microbiota, because I'm talking a lot about food. I'm talking all about food, and I look at the ways in which the industrialization of our food supply has diminished the good bacteria, the species in our gut that are protective for health and help us in so many ways, and enhanced the bad, aggressive bacteria that cause all kinds of health conditions, diabetes, certain cancers, all kinds of metabolic dysfunction, which we're seeing. In fact, there was a recent statistic showing that only 12% of the U.S. population is considered metabolically healthy, which is just astounding. I didn't know it was quite that bad. And then I talk a lot in the book. I talk a lot about how the importance of this one strain of bacteria called B. infantis, which is a strain of bacteria that babies need in their gut that they acquire through birth and through breastfeeding. But unfortunately, this one strain has been rendered extinct in the Western world or any industrialized world due to the rise in C-sections, also overuse of antibiotics, and then most importantly, the use of formula, because when babies are getting formula instead of breast milk, they're not able to supply the food that would feed this bacteria. So over the course of about 2 to 3 generations, this bacteria has gone completely extinct. And the researchers at UC Davis who made this discovery, they've done a tremendous amount of research on this and have found that this one strain of bacteria actually, when present in the infant gut, just completely takes over the gut, crowds out all the bad bacteria, and protects them from all kinds of pathogens, all kinds of chronic illnesses for your whole life. I mean, it really sets up the immune system for life. So this is just one example of the way, and the researcher at UC Davis named Bruce German, who I spent many, many hours talking to, he's like, and this is just the one that we know about. So think about all the things we don't know about what we're doing with, the industrialization of our food and how we're wrecking the gut. And then I also talk about in terms of the adult microbiome. I talked to some Stanford researchers who are finding similar studies in adults where a lifelong diet of highly processed foods lacks we call them fibers. It lacks the food that then feeds those bacteria that would be healthful and protective to our health. We're starving them out, and then we're seeing a proliferation of the really bad bacteria because we're feeding them so many sugars, refined grains, poor quality fats and oils, all kinds of inflammatory foods. And so we have this major problem now where we've gotten to a point where some of these really important strains are actually extinct, and we're going to have to figure out a way how to get them back. And it correlates quite obviously with the way we grow our food and soil health, because we're doing the same thing to the soil that we've done, to our bodies.
Right. Yeah. For years I've been saying, all broccolis aren't created equal. The same way, mom raises, when she's pregnant, what she eats affects the baby. How the soil is and how the soil's fed affects the vegetables coming out of it.
Absolutely.
And people don't think about that. From your research, does it seem like it's too far gone that those that are choosing to eat whole grains and whole foods, are their babies having this inside this bacteria, or are they also extinct? Has there been any studies
that's
people who eat well?
That was a really to be was that, in fact, even if you eat an all-organic diet and, breastfeed your baby, you're not really able to pass on this bacteria because over the past couple generations, it's just gone. I mean, they've found the bacterial strain in less industrialized countries. So there's in this country, 97% of babies no longer have that bacteria, and moms don't have it to pass on to their babies. So what you have to do is re-inoculate. So it's like you talking about probiotics, but this is a very targeted probiotic. And in fact, the researchers at UC Davis have a probiotic supplement on the market that is this B. infantis that will repopulate babies' gut. And it's the only one where there's really clinical trials to show there's proof and evidence, because there's a lot of probiotics on the market that is unclear whether or not they work. And typically I recommend, in terms of repopulating the adult gut, the very best thing you can do is eat a lot of whole foods and a lot of fermented foods. Fermented foods have so many probiotics. They're alive. We know that they are an important part of the diet. But in the case of babies, it's gone. So it's like you have to plant the seed again in order for it to grow. And that's what, fortunately, the researchers have been able to do. And I hope that that supplement, because you can buy it, but it is expensive. I'm hoping, and so are the researchers, that this will be like a public health intervention that everyone will have access to when a baby's born, so that the baby can get that protective bacteria that's so important.
You talk about fermented foods. what sources are the best fermented foods, and do that you kill them when you cook them? I mean, I know I'm always talking to people, make the miso soup, but don't add the miso, and you add the miso, per bowl or at the very end after you turn the soup off, so that you don't boil the miso, so that you don't kill the bacteria. What about, sauerkraut, heating up sauerkraut, and the difference between sauerkraut that is alive that you're buying in the refrigerated section versus jarred sauerkraut that's been on the shelf? Is there a difference?
Right. Oh, yeah. I mean, that is the crucial difference. You need to make sure when you're purchasing fermented foods that they say alive and they're in the refrigerator section because you have these bacteria and they're living and we need to keep them alive and eat them while they're alive in order for them to get into the gut and give us the beneficial, aspects that they do. So I think that, making sure and also organic's important because the nutrients in organic foods is much higher, and then when you ferment them, that aids in your ability to absorb them. But I think that if, people are interested, it's a great project to do, especially now everyone's home, and especially if you have kids, it's really fun and so simple to just buy a head of organic cabbage, chop it up, mush it up with a bunch of salt. I mean, there's easy instructions for this online, and make your own sauerkraut in your own kitchen. You can do beet kvass too. So many projects that, and just so much more affordable if you just go and buy an organic head of cabbage and make it yourself.
Good idea. How long does it take for a cabbage to turn into sauerkraut?
Not long. I mean, after about 2 to 3 days, you start getting the fermentation process, and you can just keep it going. After 3 days, you can start putting it in the fridge, but it just improves with age, and you get more and more of that good bacteria. The salt is what prohibits the bad bacteria from growing. And it's just this very simple but magical process, a great way to get nutrient density into yourself and into your kids.
Mm-hmm. Pickles are the same if you make, real fermented pickles as opposed to just, vinegar pickles. That's exactly another really great one. And I've also been making, I just started making sourdough bread during this pandemic. I had never done that before. Now, is making a sourdough, once you bake it, is the fermented product now dead?
I don't think so. I mean, my understanding is that when the fermentation process with dough is that the benefit there is you're breaking down the proteins, like the gluten protein in wheat, which some people have a hard time digesting. And that slow rise fermentation process sort of begins the cooking process before you bake it. And you're breaking it down, making it more easy to digest and more easy to assimilate a lot of those nutrients. And I think that a lot of people that I've talked to about this who have had sensitivities around eating wheat and bread, when they switch to organic, just simple whole grain sourdoughs, they can eat them and really feel good.
Right, I've heard that as well. I have a friend that avoids gluten, but she said she can eat sourdough bread, and it's wonderful.
Right, and that's the thing, is that it's all about the way we prepare, how foods are grown, the way we prepare. Sourdough is a traditional way of preparing grains, and then, so if you look at what's in the supermarket, you're looking at basically, a dead product, sliced white bread, highly refined, highly processed, lots of things added to it. That's not really bread. I mean, in terms of my whole egg theory, that doesn't meet the criteria at all, whereas a sourdough bread with 3 simple ingredients, long fermentation, that's a whole food. Right.
Also, for those listening that don't know, in order to grow wheat in this country, north of New York, let's say, and most of the wheat is actually coming from Canada, they actually spray it with glyphosate before harvesting, or when they harvest it, to help it dry quicker. And so a lot of people are saying that the allergy to gluten is really an allergy to glyphosate more than gluten. So that's also food.
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of it as well. And it's really alarming when you look at the way they're using glyphosate. I think a lot of people don't realize, even when a product says non-GMO, they're still spraying, particularly things like wheat, other grains, beans, lentils, chickpeas, all of those things. Even if it says non-GMO, and it's not organic, they're still spraying all of those crops with Roundup because, as you said, it dries out the crop, gets it to market more quickly, and, obviously they're all about making that profit. But there's high amounts of glyphosate residue on all those foods, and a researcher I spoke with for my book said, there's many problems with glyphosate, but it was never intended to be used that way, which you end up with a lot of residue on the final product when you spray it right at the end. And no one's monitoring this, and no one's checking our foods to see what kind of, no government agency, I should say, is checking to see what kind of residues are on these foods. And something a lot of people don't know about glyphosate is that it's an antimicrobial. So it's killing the good bacteria in the soil, but it's also doing that in your gut. And so we're seeing this rise in all these issues around gut health and immune health, and it does seem to be linked to the processing of our foods and particularly the application of all these chemicals and pesticides.
Right. And so that's the difference for those listening who so often people say, well, as long as it's non-GMO, I'm good. It doesn't have to be organic. That's the reason it really should be organic. And
exactly.
It's really unfortunate that organic costs more. You would think they're saving all the money on all these chemicals. It shouldn't cost more. And, the more that people buy it and demand rises for it, the price will come down. But, cooking from scratch ends up not necessarily being more. It does take more time, but, you can buy organic beans, pretty inexpensively and cook them up fresh yourself.
Right. There's the time investment. If you shop in a way where you're buying things in bulk, not only do you reduce the packaging waste, but you're also reducing your exposure to a lot of the chemicals in the packaging, which I spend some time on in the book. But it is more affordable if you shop that way. You cook everything yourself. The problem is most Americans don't have the time to do it because under normal circumstances, not during a pandemic, but people are working, really long hours. They're working long hours for less money. So, money is an issue. People don't have access to these nutrient-dense organic foods in all places. And so there's this whole kind of culture and this systemic issue around people not having access. Also, people not knowing how to cook because that was a skill that was passed on from your mom or your dad, your grandparents, whatever, that no longer is taking place because people aren't cooking in the home. They're not teaching their kids because of all those issues I just mentioned and because the industry has just kind of taken over with all its convenience products. So it is a major issue, but I do think that now people are paying much more attention to their health because of this pandemic. People seeing clearly that chronic disease and underlying conditions that are like inflammatory conditions that come from our diet are causing people to get sicker and even die from this COVID, and I think that that's bringing a lot of attention to the quality of our food and also thinking more about what do we really value? Do we need to be working so much, and do we need to be designating so much of our lives away from the home where we're not able to cook for our families and take care and nurture our families? And I think I'm hopeful that there is somewhat of a shift happening in that way.
I'm right with you on that so much.
Yeah.
Can you share some of your knowledge about freezing food? Because one thing I recommend to people as a time saver, because I'm very much aware, I've been teaching to parents for years how to cook healthy organic food, and, I recommend the freezer at times as your friend, like I make a double batch of rice and I freeze one batch of rice because organic brown rice takes, a good 40 minutes. And so that you have that you can pull out of the freezer and have ready another time. Same, my sourdough recipe, I make 2 loaves at a time. I don't eat 2 loaves. So, one loaf I'm slicing and I'm putting in the freezer and I'm taking out slices as I need them.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's your feeling on freezing?
Sorry, what did you say?
So what is your opinion about freezing? Am I killing the food? Is this a good recommendation for food? Or What's your feeling?
I think it's a great idea for the reasons you just mentioned. But when you freeze stuff, like you make it, you freeze it, you're preserving a lot of the nutrients and preserving the freshness of the food. I think it's a great idea. We do the same thing. We buy all our beans in bulk, and just you make a huge batch, and then you cool them and you store them in mason jars in the freezer, and then you can just easily take a jar out as you need it throughout the week or whatever for all your different cooking needs. And you can do that with virtually everything. Right.
And I do, well, good, I'm glad to hear that, because I recommend that because those are ways to make cooking for yourself and your family much easier if you can make something, where people, can have time on the weekend when they're working during the week. Or they can make that batch of chili and freeze it.
Yeah,
so good.
Big batches. And the other thing I recommend that we do in our house, and I've always recommended to all the people I work with consulting for nutrition, is if you meal plan, it makes a huge difference in your week and your stress levels around food and eating. And so just really simply sitting down, thinking what you're going to eat for dinner each night, and then shopping according to that plan. And you can do what we just talked about, which is you can get things in bulk that you freeze ahead of time, so that if you're going to be busy certain nights, and you can easily whip something up with a bunch of beans and grains or whatever you have stored, and then add some fresh vegetables to it. It's just a great way to get more organized around food and not have that 5 p.m. crunch of what am I going to eat for dinner, and then ending up ordering something that's not so great for you.
Right, absolutely. So, Kristin, we're going to take a couple-minute break, and when we come back, I want to talk some more about your book and endocrine disruptors, because we haven't touched on that yet. So everyone listening, don't go anywhere. If you're just joining us, my guest is Kristin Lawless, author of Formerly Known as Food. Be right back.
The Dr. Peter Breggin Hour interviews the most exciting innovators in the field of mental health, from therapists and researchers to advocates of patient rights. Join me and other pioneers in psychology, psychiatry, and empathic living, with the aim of improving your life and the lives of everyone you touch. Wednesdays at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Listen live or on the archives 24/7 at prn.fm. And don't forget to rate the show on iTunes. The Progressive Radio Network is moving forward, and we hope you are coming with us.
Hi, everybody. I am Karen Hartglass, the host of It's All About Food. Join me every Tuesday from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time, or catch all of my shows in the archives. You can find my archived programs at the Progressive Radio Network website, or you can call my personal archive phone number to hear the most recent 5 episodes of It's All About Food. Here's the number: 1-701-719-0885. Here it is again: 1-701-719-0885. Learn about how we can solve many of the world's problems today and do it deliciously here on It's All About Food.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back. If you're just joining us, you're listening to Bhavani at iEat Green on the Progressive Radio Network, and my guest today is Kristin Lawless, author of Formerly Known as Food, How the Industrial Food System is Changing Our Minds, Bodies, and Culture. So, Kristin, right before the break, I was touching on endocrine disruptors. And you talk a lot about endocrine disruptors, and I think people have heard the term but don't really know what that is. Maybe you could share that with everyone.
Sure. The term endocrine disruptor just basically means hormone disruption. And endocrine disruptors are found throughout our food supply and our environment in general. For example, the pesticide we just talked about, glyphosate. More research is coming out that indicates that glyphosate is, in fact, also an endocrine disruptor. They're also in lots of food packaging, which I spent a lot of time talking about. So all plastics seem to have people have heard of, like BPA, for example, phthalates. These are just a couple of the many, many hundreds, maybe even 1,000 chemicals that qualify as endocrine disruptors. And so basically what endocrine disruptors do, they mimic hormones in your body. So they're very similar to naturally occurring hormones. But what they do is when you get them in your body, they replace them in different cell receptor sites, and this can wreak havoc. I mean, things from all the neurodevelopment in babies and children, issues, brain issues later in life, thyroid issues, metabolic dysfunction clearly linked, diabetes, obesity clearly linked to many of these endocrine disruptors, certain cancers, breast cancer, so hormone-sensitive cancers like breast cancer, prostate cancer, clearly linked in many, many studies to endocrine disrupting chemicals. The thing about endocrine disrupting chemicals that's so crucial for people to understand is that they cause these kind of problems in very, very tiny, tiny trace amounts. And this is where the regulatory agencies have not caught up with this science. And they say, there's only trace amounts, for example, of glyphosate in your oatmeal. They know, the FDA said there is Roundup in your oatmeal, but it's okay because it's just a small amount. Well, all the researchers that are independent researchers, highly regarded researchers that I spent many hours talking to, say that's completely wrong. The way hormones work in the body is they operate on extremely low dose levels. So, like, for example, you can take a very low dose birth control pill, and that will stop the body from ovulating. So it just shows you how sensitive our bodies are to these hormones or hormone-like substances, which is what these chemicals are. And so the regulatory agencies have refused to acknowledge the recent science, and they are not protecting public health as a result, because we are all exposed to trace amounts. And also, don't forget, it's not just the one chemical at a time. We're all taking in multiple chemicals. One researcher told me he wouldn't be surprised if the average American's taking in 100 unique chemicals a day in combination, and no one has studied the combined effects of these chemicals. And so this is why it's so crucially important to buy organic foods whenever possible, because you're limiting your exposure to these. And secondly, to really minimize your exposure to plastics. And plastic is everywhere. I mean, it is impossible to avoid entirely, but thinking about bottled water, bottled drinks, I mean, those should just be off the table. We don't need them. You can buy a water filter and filter your water for less money than continuing to buy plastic bottles. And then all the food packaging, everything comes in plastic. And so trying to find companies, it's a challenge, but that don't use these kinds of plastic packaging, which are contaminating our food with these kinds of chemicals.
Right. Even storage containers, you're much better off getting the Pyrex glass ones, by the way, for those listening, I actually freeze my food in the Pyrex glass containers because they can come right out. They can go right into the freezer. They can come out, go into your refrigerator, come out, go into your oven. They're just great. Right. But storing in plastic is not good. And also, for those that don't know, the dishwasher, a lot of times people put plastic, like I have plastic plates that I use outside for serving because I don't want, broken glass out by the pool. Mm-hmm. But then I have to wash those by hand, because I'm not going to put plastic into the dishwasher. So that's something that most people don't realize either.
Yeah, right. Heating, cooling, the temperature going up and down in plastics tends to release more of the chemical. Also, there's studies to show that when the foods are really fatty, so for example, canned and tinned fish that have high amounts of oil, sardines, things like that, in those, it's not just plastic, it's also those cans, like those they're lined with, you don't think it's plastic, but it's lined with this type of plastic, and that leaches into those foods quite readily because the fat content sort of draws out the chemical, and there's plenty of studies on that. So just really trying to minimize, like I said, it isn't possible at this point, but I do think that we have some power in terms of telling manufacturers, I mean, if you're making a really nice organic, grass-fed yogurt, why that needs to be in glass. If you're committed to health and you're committed to preserving the environment, I really feel strongly that you should have that in glass. And I actually started this new Instagram account called Kristin, Can I Eat This? Because so many of my friends have said, every time I'm in the store, I want to send you a picture of something and ask you if I can eat it. So we started doing it on my Instagram account, and I've gotten so many submissions from people. And I have found that there's some really high quality food products, but they're in plastic. And so I've been contacting all these companies to say, this is a great product. Would you consider using something other than plastic, not only for human health but for environmental health? And I just think that we have, a certain amount of power that way if we can all, in a collective sense of all coming together and just trying to pressure these companies to do that.
Right. Yeah, that's a good one. I never really thought about yogurt because, all yogurt, all the organic yogurt, almost all of it. I think I've seen a few in, there's this one brand that puts it out in actually a ceramic case. It's really beautiful, but it's, it's like $4 as opposed to, $1 or $2 for the same amount.
I think some of those do deposits on some of that too. And like I'm in California, so and Strauss milk, for example, all comes in glass, and you return the bottle for $1.50 deposit, and you're also supporting the environment that way because you're not throwing your plastic in the recycle, which actually we know doesn't really get recycled, just goes to landfill, ends up in the ocean. And that's one other important point, because not only are you exposing yourself to the chemical when you eat out of the packaging, but when you put it back out into the environment, it doesn't go away. It goes back into the environment, and then we're exposed again to all those plastics in the fish we eat because the ocean is contaminated, in the soil because the soil is contaminated. So it doesn't stop with just your own personal health. It has all these other broader implications.
Right, absolutely. Now, going back to the endocrine disruptors, people always are asking, isn't that what our regulatory agencies are supposed to do? They're supposed to be testing. But, as you write in your book, they don't do the testing. They allow industry to do the testing. And in fact, the testing, most of the standards are set on adult men, not on little children. And I recently was writing about another pesticide where they actually, instead of reducing the amount of safe exposure, they're changing the regulations so that they're allowing children to have 3 times more the amount of the pesticide so that they meet the standard, as opposed to changing the standard. Can you talk a little bit about our regulatory agencies and why they're not protecting us?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty simple. They've been completely bought out by industry, and the big agricultural companies, big food companies, and the chemical manufacturers that make all these things that go into the packaging, the food, pesticides, all of that, they just are. There's huge conflicts of interest when you look at that. There's revolving doors between the people in those companies and the people at our regulatory agencies. There's just so much pressure to allow industry to continue, essentially poisoning our food, our air, our water. It's shocking, but it's so obvious, and so I'm always surprised that people don't realize, like the FDA, the EPA, those are public agencies that their whole point for existing is supposed to be protecting the public health. They're funded with our tax dollars to do that, and they're not doing it. They're just protecting industry profits, and I think that's outrageous, and I think more people should be really upset about this because they're decimating our environment. I mean, look what's happening with climate change and the dying off of all these important species and pollinators and the oceans. I mean, it goes on, and they need to be called out for what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think the best ways of calling them out are?
Well, first of all,
my
need to
listening, who are willing to become active participants in our society to try to make these changes. Are signing petitions really doing anything? Do we need to write letters? Do we need to, we can't show up at rallies anymore right now anyway.
I know.
The best?
I think that we've seen in the past where petitions do work to influence different kinds of regulations and things. I do think that's important. I think it's important to just start organizing on a more local level too, like getting to know your neighbors, getting to know people around you, and getting this information out in your communities, and thinking about ways that you can help protect your immediate environment, ways that you can start possibly coming together and growing your own food in community plots, or sharing foods, sharing resources. These are all ways that are really empowering, really feel good to reconnect with your community and just being active on that level. And then, as I mentioned, via social media, like through my Instagram account, Kristin, Can I Eat This? I'm just trying to get this information to as many people as possible, and then we can start putting pressure on these companies by sending them emails, because they are responsive and they do want to know what their consumers want. Again, I mean, they have a profit agenda too. So I think when you start collectively thinking about ways you can pressure these companies, some companies, boycotts have worked in the past for certain companies when you do it on a big scale. So I think that getting people all the knowledge and getting all on board together, it has so much power. And, check out my Instagram account and my website and my Twitter, and I'm going to be thinking of ways that we can get, collectivize and get some actions going.
Yeah. Those are great suggestions. You also have some upcoming online classes that I thought you could share with my audience in case anyone is an expectant parent out there, or has young children and needs some help in feeding them and getting them healthy. Maybe you could share those with everyone. Yeah,
absolutely. So I've been teaching some Zoom classes with this woman, Mary Esther Malloy, who's a childbirth expert in New York City. She's a parenting expert. She was my doula when I had my son. And we're teaching classes on nutrition, and we're calling them the Whole Egg series because it's based on my whole egg theory. And we're teaching them for parents. We're teaching people about breastfeeding, the microbiota. We're teaching people, we have a class called Breastfeeding, Sleep, and the Microbiota. We have a class called Real Food for Babies, Toddlers, and their microbiota. So we'll be talking all about the gut health, how that's important for strengthening your immunity, your family's immunity. And we have a class called The Whole Egg for Parents, where it's a 4-course series where we break down sort of my whole nutrition philosophy, and then we do all these fun kitchen projects where you can have your kids come watch for like the last 20 minutes, and we do beet kvass, or we're doing for all these fermented projects in the kitchen, or small gardening projects that kids aren't going to camp, so we're thinking of it as sort of like a fun family activity, teaching your kids about the importance of whole foods and organics and growing and fermenting. And so if you want more information about all those classes, you can check out my Instagram account, which is Kristin, Can I Eat This? And you can go to my website, which is KristinLawless.com. And also on Twitter and Facebook, you can find information. If people can email me through my website if they have specific questions too.
That's great, and I'll put that on my website too. So if anyone didn't get that information, you'll find it on my website. Also interesting, talking about babies and and feeding them well and health. It's always shocking to me that we have one of the lowest mortality rates for mothers and babies in our country, which is, supposed to be, the most advanced Western, country. Such bull.
Right.
It's just ridiculous. We are just so far from having it together when it comes to caring about people and health and what's good for us.
I know.
I tell people they really have to be their own advocates and really go out and, do the research.
Absolutely. And, there's really no regard for the really importance of protecting mothers and babies, of making sure mothers are as healthy as possible throughout pregnancy with a nutrient-dense diet. It's great. That's why I had a doula, because, having those support systems makes a big difference in birth outcomes. Unfortunately, that's cost prohibitive to a lot of people. And those maternal death rates and the child death rates, and that's just outrageous. Like you said, allegedly the most advanced country in the world. We have one of the worst infant mortality rates and maternal mortality rates too. We have a major problem with our medical system, and that needs to be addressed also.
Yeah. Well, I think if our government was paying for our medical care, it would incentivize them to get us healthier.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
I would love to see that. So you also talk about putting warning labels on industrial food, and you talk about the celebrity marketing of junk foods. All that is just so important. I mean, especially how they market to infants. I mean, not to infants, but to toddlers and to children.
Right.
You know, that's just such a problem. And I thought they had made a law saying that, you know, they could not focus and market to children, and yet they just really, I think this is another area where they left it up to industry to decide, to monitor themselves. Is that still true?
Yeah, there's very little regulation in terms of how these companies market and advertise their products, and there are a couple recent Yale studies showing that they aggressively target young people and people of color too, and that, I mean, to me, that's criminal, basically, what they're doing, because they know their products cause such harm, and they're specifically targeting people who are already vulnerable to chronic disease. And, that needs to, I mean, I have at the end of my book, I have a New Food Movement manifesto, and one of my main points is, like, we have to curtail this advertising. There needs to be strict regulations. If you're advertising, you can't advertise these really, terrible processed foods that are making people sick, and I strongly believe that celebrities need to stop endorsing them. I'm always outraged when I see these people who clearly don't need the money, and they're advertising soda and chips and fast food. That has to stop. And I do think that we could start putting labels on foods that are really bad for our health. I mean, especially now we're seeing, like, with this pandemic, if you have an underlying chronic disease, you're much more likely to get seriously ill or even die. And that needs to be more well understood among the public. And if we had some kind of regulation that if a food meets a certain criteria, it needs to have a label like, warning, this may be hazardous to your health, because it's true.
Right. Absolutely. Well, Kristin, I want to thank you so much. It has been such a great conversation. Everyone, I recommend you get the book, formerly known as Food. It's wonderful and has so much important information. And follow Kristin. She, keeps writing these great articles. So, Kristin, thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate you having me on.
You're welcome. And everyone out there, have a great rest of the week. Stay safe, eat well, and I'll see you all again next week. And join my next Zoom on Wednesday evening at 6 p.m.